12-year-old Aaliyah Carter wrote 4 simple words on her Career Legacy Day assignment that would change everything. My father is a federal judge. When Ms. Hart read it aloud to the class with a mocking smile, when the laughter erupted and detention was assigned for dishonesty, when grades began dropping and isolation became Aaliyah's new reality, the experienced teacher felt completely in control. She had no idea she'd just publicly humiliated the daughter of a man who spent his career holding powerful institutions accountable, and she definitely didn't know that her carefully hidden pattern of discrimination was about to be exposed in the most devastating way possible. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. 12-year-old Aaliyah Carter sat in the front row of Ms. Hart's 7th grade classroom, her pencil moving steadily across lined paper. The Tuesday morning sunlight cut through the tall windows of Lincoln Middle School, casting long rectangles across desks that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old wood. Aaliyah's navy uniform cardigan was buttoned neatly, her natural hair pulled back in 2 careful puffs, and her notebook was already half filled with color-coded notes from the morning's pre-algebra lesson. She was the kind of student who arrived early, who kept her materials organized in labeled folders, who rarely spoke unless called upon. But every few minutes, her dark eyes would flick toward the clock above the whiteboard, as if she was waiting for something specific to happen. Ms. Evelyn Hart stood at the front of the room, her blonde hair swept into a sleek bun, her cream blouse crisp and professional. She was in her late 30s, with the kind of polished appearance that made parents trust her immediately at back-to-school nights. She had taught at Lincoln for nearly 12 years, long enough to have a reputation. Some called her strict, others called her fair. The administration called her one of their most reliable teachers. She commanded respect through a particular kind of controlled authority: the raised eyebrow, the precisely timed pause, the smile that could turn from warm to cold in an instant. "All right, class," Ms. Hart announced, clapping her hands twice to gather attention. "Put away your math work. We're moving on to our next assignment." She picked up a stack of papers from her desk and began walking down the aisles, placing one sheet face down on each student's desk. This assignment is called Career Legacy Day. You're going to write a short essay about what your parents do for a living. Not what you wish they did. Not what sounds impressive. What they actually do. A few students groaned. Someone in the back muttered, "My dad just sells insurance." Ms. Hart smiled thinly. "Then you write about insurance. Honesty is what matters here. I want you to understand that every job has value, and that pretending to be something you're not is worse than being ordinary." She paused at Aaliyah's desk, placed the paper down without making eye contact, and continued walking. "You have until the end of class. This will be graded on both writing quality and truthfulness." Aaliyah flipped the paper over and read the prompt. Her stomach tightened slightly, but she picked up her pencil and began writing. She didn't hesitate. She didn't exaggerate. She simply wrote what was true. Around her, other students scribbled quickly. The girl next to her, Emma Wallace, wrote about her mother being a veterinarian. Across the aisle, Tyler Bennett wrote about his father managing a car dealership. Behind Aaliyah, 3 boys, Connor Hayes, Jake Dawson, and Ryan Fletcher, leaned back in their chairs, snickering quietly about something on Connor's phone. They were the sons of influential parents. Connor's father was on the school board. Jake's mother ran a prominent real estate agency. Ryan's parents owned half the commercial property downtown. They moved through the school like they owned it, and in many ways, they did. When the timer went off, Ms. Hart collected the papers row by row. She walked back to her desk, sat down, and began reading through them with a red pen in hand. The room fell into uneasy silence as students pretended to read independently while actually watching her face for reactions. Ms. Hart's expression remained neutral as she skimmed most essays. She nodded occasionally, made a few check marks, wrote brief comments in the margins. Then she reached Aaliyah's paper. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. She read it again, slower this time. Then she looked up at Aaliyah, her mouth curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Well," Ms. Hart said, her voice carrying that dangerous kind of calm that made students sit up straighter, "this is certainly creative. Aaliyah's hands folded tightly in her lap under the desk, out of sight. Miss Hart stood, holding the paper between two fingers like it might be contaminated. She walked slowly toward the front of Aaliyah's row, her heels clicking against the linoleum. Aaliyah wrote something very interesting. I think the whole class should hear it. She held the paper up, tilting her head with theatrical curiosity. She says her father is a federal judge. The room erupted, not loudly at first, but in that rippling, infectious way that laughter spreads when it's given permission. Connor Hayes snorted. Jake Dawson slapped his desk. Ryan Fletcher repeated the words federal judge in a mocking tone, drawing out each syllable. Other students turned in their seats to stare at Aaliyah, some grinning, others looking uncomfortable but not willing to break from the group. Ms. Hart didn't stop them. Instead, she raised one perfectly groomed eyebrow and let the moment breathe. Her smile widened just enough to show she found this amusing too. She waited until the laughter peaked, then held up one hand for silence. A federal judge, she repeated, her voice dripping with mock admiration. That's a very imaginative answer, Aaliyah. Very ambitious. Aaliyah's voice was quiet but steady. It's true. Ms. Hart's smile didn't waver. Sweetheart, I understand that sometimes children feel embarrassed about their family situations. That's completely normal. But lying about something this significant? She shook her head slowly, her expression shifting to something that looked almost pitying. That's a common coping mechanism among children from unstable backgrounds. I've seen it before. The classroom went silent in a different way now. The laughter had stopped, replaced by something heavier. A few students exchanged glances. Emma Wallace looked down at her desk. But Connor, Jake, and Ryan were grinning like they just won something. I'm not lying, Aaliyah said, her voice smaller now but still firm. Ms. Hart walked closer, leaning one hip against the desk next to Aaliyah's. Her tone shifted to something softer, more condescending. Aaliyah, I'm not angry with you. I'm concerned. Making up stories about your parents can seem harmless now, but these kinds of lies can follow you into adulthood. They can damage your credibility. Do you understand what I'm saying? Aaliyah didn't answer. Her hands were still folded under the desk, knuckles pressed together so tightly they hurt. Connor Hayes raised his hand, not waiting to be called on. Ms. Hart, maybe her dad works at the courthouse, like cleaning it or something. The room exploded again. This time the laughter was louder, meaner. Jake Dawson added, yeah, maybe he's a janitor and she just got confused. Ryan Fletcher chimed in, or security. That's basically like being a judge, right? Ms. Hart didn't correct them. She straightened, smoothing her blouse, and walked back to her desk. All right, that's enough. But Aaliyah, I'm assigning you detention today after school. Not as punishment, but as an opportunity to reflect on the importance of honesty. She wrote something in her planner, her pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. Lying disrupts the learning environment. It wastes everyone's time. And more importantly, it disrespects the trust we're trying to build in this classroom. Aaliyah stared straight ahead. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just sat there, her face carefully blank, while the other students whispered and glanced at her like she was something strange and pitiful. The bell rang eventually. Students packed their bags and filed out, some still giggling, others silent. Emma Wallace paused near Aaliyah's desk, opened her mouth like she might say something, then thought better of it and left. Aaliyah walked home alone that afternoon. Detention had been an hour of sitting in silence while Ms. Hart graded papers and occasionally glanced up with that same tight smile. When Aaliyah was finally released, the hallways were empty, the building quiet except for the distant sound of a vacuum cleaner and the hum of fluorescent lights. She took the long route home, the one that passed through downtown. The buildings that were taller, older, made of stone and brick that had weathered decades. She walked past the district courthouse, imposing structure with wide steps and tall columns. She didn't look up at the building itself. Instead, she watched the people coming in and out, lawyers in dark suits carrying briefcases, security guards checking IDs, families walking together toward the entrance. At home, her mother was in the kitchen preparing dinner. The house smelled like garlic and onions, warm and safe. Aaliyah dropped her backpack by the stairs and went to her room, closing the door quietly behind her. Her father came home an hour later. She heard his voice downstairs, deep and steady, talking with her mother. Then footsteps on the stairs. A knock on her door. "Come in," Aaliyah said. Judge Malcolm Carter was a tall man with broad shoulders and a presence that filled rooms without effort. He wore his work clothes still, dark slacks, a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, his tie loosened. His face was kind but serious, the kind of face that made people tell the truth, even when it was hard. He sat on the edge of her bed. "Your mother said you seemed upset. Want to talk about it?" Aaliyah told him. Not all of it. She minimized the laughter, left out the specific words the boys had used, made it sound smaller than it was. "Ms. Hart didn't believe me when I said what you do. She thinks I was lying. She gave me detention." Malcolm Carter's jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just enough that Aaliyah noticed. But he didn't interrupt. He didn't make promises. He just listened, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Did you tell the truth?" "Yes." "Then you did what you were supposed to do." He stood, kissed the top of her head, and walked to the door. Before he left, he turned back. Sometimes people don't want to believe the truth because it makes them uncomfortable. That's not your fault. Don't carry that. That night, after Aaliyah was asleep, Ms. Evelyn Hart sat at her home office desk with a glass of white wine and her laptop open. She typed an email to the school counselor, Ms. Patricia Monroe, with the subject line, "Student Concern, Aaliyah Carter." The email was professional, carefully worded. She described Aaliyah's delusional claim about her father's profession. She mentioned identity confusion and possible instability in the home environment. She suggested a counseling evaluation and closer monitoring. She framed it all as genuine concern, the kind that would look responsible in a file, the kind that would protect her if questions were ever asked later. She hit send, finished her wine, and went to bed feeling like she'd done her job. The next morning, Aaliyah arrived at school hoping yesterday had been forgotten. It hadn't. As she walked to her locker, she noticed the stares. Some students looked away when she made eye contact. Others didn't bother hiding their amusement. By second period, she'd overheard her name whispered 3 separate times, always followed by muffled laughter. Someone had drawn a judge's gavel on the bathroom wall with her initials underneath it. The janitor would paint over it by lunch, but the damage was already done. In Ms. Hart's class, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. When Aaliyah raised her hand to answer a question about fractions, Ms. Hart's eyes slid past her like she was invisible. She called on Emma instead, even though Emma's hand had gone up second. When Aaliyah tried again during the vocabulary review, Ms. Hart called on Jake, who gave a half-hearted answer that was barely correct. Ms. Hart praised it anyway. "Good effort, Jake. I can see you're really thinking critically about the material. That's what I want to see from all of you." Aaliyah lowered her hand slowly, her arm suddenly feeling heavy. She didn't raise it again that day, or the next, or the day after that. She learned quickly that invisibility was safer than visibility in Ms. Hart's classroom. Later that week, Ms. Hart announced a group project on ecosystems. "You'll be working in teams of 4. Choose your partners now. You have 2 minutes." The room burst into motion. Students turned in their seats, calling out names, forming clusters. Aaliyah sat still, waiting for someone to make eye contact. Emma glanced at her, then quickly looked away when Connor waved her over. Other students moved past her desk like she wasn't there. When the 2 minutes ended, Aaliyah was still sitting alone. Ms. Hart surveyed the room with false surprise. "Oh, Aaliyah, it looks like you don't have a group yet." She tapped her pen against her grade book, pretending to think. "Let's see. Connor's group only has 3. You'll join them." Connor's face fell. "But Ms. Hart, we already divided up the work." "Then you'll divide it again. 4 is better than 3. Ms. Hart turned back to the board, dismissing the complaint. Aaliyah gathered her things and moved to the back table where Connor, Jake, and Ryan sat. None of them looked at her. Connor slid a piece of paper across the table. "We're doing rainforests. We already picked our sections. You can do the bibliography. I can help with research, too," Aaliyah offered quietly. "We're good," Ryan said flatly. "Just do the citations." For the next week, Aaliyah worked on the bibliography while her group members barely acknowledged her presence. She formatted sources, double-checked spelling, made sure every entry followed the required style guide. She even found 3 additional academic sources that strengthened their research. When she mentioned them to Connor, he shrugged. Whatever. Just add them to the list. Presentation day arrived. Each group stood at the front of the room to share their findings. When Connor's group was called, all 4 of them walked to the front, but only Connor, Jake, and Ryan spoke. They presented slides they'd made together, shared facts they'd researched, answered Ms. Hart's questions with practiced confidence. Aaliyah stood to the side, holding the bibliography packet, waiting for her turn to explain the sources. It never came. Ms. Hart thanked the boys, wrote grades in her book, and said, "Nice work. You can sit down now." Aaliyah lingered for a second, confused. Should I explain the sources? Ms. Hart glanced at her like she'd forgotten she was there. That won't be necessary. The citations speak for themselves. They sat down. Connor got an A. So did Jake and Ryan. Aaliyah got a B-. Her heart sank when she saw the grade written in red pen at the top of her bibliography packet. When she asked why after class, Ms. Hart barely looked up from her desk. She was organizing papers into color-coded folders, her movements precise and dismissive. Your contribution felt minimal, Aaliyah. The bibliography was fine, technically correct, but the language felt copied. Almost like you pulled descriptions directly from the sources without understanding them, without processing the material yourself. I wrote those summaries myself. Aaliyah's voice was barely above a whisper. I've been teaching for a long time. I can recognize original thinking versus regurgitation. There's a difference between parroting information and truly comprehending it. Ms. Hart closed her gradebook with a soft thud that felt louder than it was. You're dismissed now. 2 days later, Emma Wallace's group presented. Their rainforest project used nearly identical phrasing to what Aaliyah had included in her summaries. Phrasing Emma had seen when Aaliyah showed her the sources during lunch. When Emma read the description of deforestation patterns, Ms. Hart's face lit up. Beautiful explanation, Emma. I love how you synthesized complex ideas into accessible language. That's exactly what I'm looking for. Upru. Aaliyah sat frozen in her seat, staring at her desk. The words were hers. The research was hers. But the praise went to someone else. Her grades began slipping after that. Not because she stopped trying. Because Ms. Hart started marking things wrong without explanation. A math problem Aaliyah solved correctly got a red X, with no note about what she'd done wrong. An essay on character development came back covered in red ink, with vague comments like unclear reasoning and needs work, while Tyler Bennett's essay, which had similar arguments and worse grammar, got a B+ and a smiley face. Aaliyah started second-guessing everything. She'd rewrite sentences 5 times, check her math twice, read passages over and over trying to figure out what she was missing. Her confidence eroded like soil in rain, slowly at first, then all at once. At home, she stopped talking about school. When her parents asked how her day was, she said fine. When her mother noticed her report card, she frowned. These grades aren't like you, sweetheart. Is everything okay? I'm just tired, Aaliyah lied. Her father studied her face across the dinner table. He didn't push, but he noticed. 3 weeks after the Career Legacy Day assignment, Ms. Hart sent an email to Malcolm Carter requesting a parent-teacher conference. She scheduled it for 2 p.m. on a Thursday, right in the middle of standard working hours. She assumed he wouldn't be able to attend. Most parents couldn't. Malcolm cleared his calendar. He arrived exactly on time, wearing a suit but no robe, carrying a leather portfolio but no briefcase. Ms. Hart was waiting in her classroom, seated behind her desk in a position of authority. When he walked in, she stood and extended her hand with a practiced smile. Mr. Carter, thank you so much for coming. I know how difficult it can be to get time off work. Her tone was warm, but there was a patronizing edge underneath, like she was congratulating him for showing up at all. I made time, Malcolm said simply, shaking her hand once before sitting in the chair across from her desk. The chair designed for children, slightly too small, positioned lower than hers. Ms. Hart settled back in her seat, folding her hands on top of a folder with Aaliyah's name on it. I want to talk with you about some concerns I have regarding Aaliyah's recent behavior and academic performance. I am listening. She opened the folder, pulling out papers covered in red ink. As you can see, her grades have been declining. Her participation has dropped. And more concerning, she's been displaying some troubling patterns of dishonesty. Malcolm's expression didn't change. Dishonesty. Yes. Ms. Hart leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on that same soft, concerned tone she'd used with Aaliyah. A few weeks ago, she made some claims about your profession that were, frankly, unrealistic. When I addressed it, she became defensive. Since then, I've noticed her isolating herself, not engaging with peers. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Mr. Carter, I've been teaching for over a decade. I've seen this before. Children sometimes invent stories about their parents to avoid embarrassment about their actual circumstances. Malcolm let the silence sit for a moment. Then he said, very calmly, "What did she say I do?" Ms. Hart hesitated, clearly uncomfortable repeating it. "She said you were a federal judge." "I am." Ms. Hart's smile faltered. "Just slightly. I appreciate you trying to support her, but I'm a judge for the United States District Court. I've held the position for 6 years." His voice was even, factual. "Would you like to verify that?" Ms. Hart blinked. Her smile became tighter, more rigid. "Of course, I didn't mean to imply," she cleared her throat, shuffling the papers in front of her. "Well, regardless of your profession, the issue remains that Aaliyah has been struggling academically. I think it's important we address her performance rather than get sidetracked by the fact that you called my daughter a liar in front of her entire class." The room went very still. Miss Hart's face flushed. "I never used that word." "You didn't have to." Malcolm leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed but his gaze unwavering. "You humiliated her publicly, assigned her detention, and flagged her to the counselor for psychological evaluation. All because she told the truth. That's not." Ms. Hart stopped herself, regrouping. Her professional mask slipped back into place. "Mr. Carter, I understand you're upset, but you have to understand that from my perspective, it seemed highly unlikely." "Why?" The question hung in the air. Ms. Hart opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "Because most parents in this district don't work in those kinds of positions," she said carefully. "I was making an educated assumption based on experience." "Based on what experience, specifically?" Malcolm's tone remained calm, almost curious. "What about my daughter made you assume she was lying?" Ms. Hart's jaw tightened. "I think we're getting off track here." "I don't." Malcolm stood, his full height making the small classroom feel smaller. "I think we're exactly on track. My daughter told the truth. You didn't believe her. And rather than admit you made a mistake, you've spent the last month undermining her academically and socially." He picked up his portfolio. "I'll be requesting copies of all her graded work, participation records, and any communications you've had with administration regarding her." Ms. Hart stood as well, her hands braced against her desk. "You're welcome to request whatever you'd like, but I can assure you everything I've done has been in Aaliyah's best interest." "Then you won't mind the review." Malcolm walked to the door, then paused. "One more thing. If my daughter's grades continue to decline, or if she continues to be isolated in your classroom, I'll be asking very specific questions about why, and I'll expect very specific answers." He left without waiting for a response. Ms. Hart stood alone in her classroom, her hands trembling slightly. She waited until she heard his footsteps fade down the hallway. Then she sat down, opened her email, and began typing. The message went to Principal David Warren and copied the district superintendent. The subject line read, "Potentially hostile parent. Immediate attention required." She described Malcolm Carter as aggressive, threatening, and attempting to intimidate her into changing grades. She mentioned his claims about being a federal judge, framing it as part of a pattern of deception. She requested administrative support and suggested that any future meetings include a third party for her protection. She hit send, closed her laptop, and exhaled slowly. Down the hall, Principal Warren read the email on his phone. His face went pale. He recognized the name Malcolm Carter. He'd seen it in the news. He'd seen it on court documents. Just last month, Judge Carter had presided over a high-profile civil rights case that made headlines across the state. His photograph had been in the newspaper. His rulings were cited in legal journals. This wasn't someone claiming to be a judge. This was an actual federal judge. And Ms. Hart had just accused his daughter of lying about it. Warren's hands felt cold. He read the email again, his stomach sinking with each sentence. Ms. Hart had described Judge Carter as aggressive and threatening. But Warren knew what that language really meant when applied to black parents who questioned authority. He'd seen it before. He'd signed off on it before. And now it was going to come back on all of them. He picked up his phone and called the superintendent immediately, his voice tight. "We have a problem," he said. "A serious one." Across town, Malcolm Carter drove home in silence. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. He wanted to say more. He'd wanted to raise his voice, to demand immediate action, to make Ms. Hart understand the weight of what she'd done. But he'd learned long ago that anger from someone who looked like him was always read as aggression, no matter how justified. So he'd stayed calm. He'd stayed professional. He'd documented everything mentally and left with his dignity intact. But it had cost him. It always did. At home, Aaliyah was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework when he walked in. She looked up, searching his face for answers. "How did it go?" she asked quietly. Malcolm set his portfolio down and sat across from her. "It went the way it needed to go." Is she going to stop? He wanted to promise her yes. He wanted to guarantee that everything would be different tomorrow, that Ms. Hart would apologize, that the other kids would leave her alone. But he'd been a judge long enough to know that justice moved slowly, and sometimes it didn't move at all. "I don't know yet," he said honestly, "but I want you to keep doing what you're doing. Keep telling the truth. Keep working hard. Don't let her make you smaller." Aaliyah nodded, but her eyes were tired in a way that 12-year-olds shouldn't be tired. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the past month. The laughter, the stares, the red ink, the loneliness of sitting at a table with 3 boys who treated her like she was invisible. She thought about Emma, who used to save her a seat at lunch but now sat with Connor's group. She thought about the substitute teacher who'd told her she was smart, the only adult at school who'd been kind to her in weeks. She wondered if telling the truth was supposed to feel this hard. Meanwhile, Ms. Hart sat in her living room, scrolling through her phone. The superintendent hadn't responded to the email yet, but Principal Warren had sent a brief acknowledgement. She felt confident in her position. She'd documented everything. She'd framed her concerns appropriately. She'd followed protocol. If Malcolm Carter wanted to make an issue of this, he'd find that the system protected teachers who followed the rules. She poured herself another glass of wine and opened Facebook, scrolling past vacation photos and recipe videos. In the teacher's lounge that afternoon, before the parent conference, she'd mentioned the meeting to 2 other teachers. One had laughed and said, "Parents always think their kids are special." The other had rolled her eyes and added, "They'll believe anything their children tell them." Ms. Hart had smiled at that. She'd felt validated, supported, right? She had no idea that in 48 hours, everything would begin to unravel. The records request would come through legal channels. The patterns would emerge. And the words she'd written so confidently in emails would be read by people who knew exactly what they really meant. But tonight, she felt safe, protected by policy, by procedure, by precedent, by the assumption that the system would back her up. She finished her wine and went to bed, her alarm already set for another day of teaching, certain that she'd done nothing wrong. The email from Ms. Hart had triggered something Malcolm Carter recognized immediately. The closing of institutional ranks, the protection of reputation over truth, the careful language designed to reframe accountability as aggression. The superintendent's office scheduled an emergency meeting for the following Monday, but Malcolm knew they were buying time to coordinate their response. On Friday morning, exactly 72 hours after the parent conference, a formal records request arrived at Lincoln Middle School through the district's legal department, properly filed under the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. The request was comprehensive. All of Aaliyah Carter's graded assignments, participation records, disciplinary notes, communications regarding her performance or behavior, and any psychological evaluations or referrals. Principal Warren stared at the request, his coffee going cold. The language was clinical, professional, impossible to refuse. Malcolm had called in a favor from an old law school friend who specialized in education discrimination cases. On Monday afternoon, the files arrived. What Malcolm received was telling not for what it contained, but for what it didn't. Aaliyah's records from September showed consistent A's and B's with comments like excellent participation. Then, after Career Legacy Day, the grades dropped. Comments became sparse. Needs improvement. Lacking effort. But there were gaps. Emails mentioned in other documents simply weren't there. Assignments Aaliyah remembered completing didn't appear. The documentation was selective, framed to support declining performance rather than targeted punishment. Malcolm sat at his home office that evening reading everything twice. His wife, Dr. Diane Carter, looked over his shoulder. "They left things out," she said quietly. "I know. You pointed to graded math quizzes. Same problems. Aaliyah's answers marked wrong with no explanation. Other students, identical methods, full credit." Diane's jaw tightened. She'd watched their daughter become quieter, watched her confidence erode. What's next? They scheduled a disciplinary hearing for Friday. It's about closing ranks, justifying everything Ms. Hart has done. "And you're going to let them?" Malcolm looked at his wife. "I'm going to let them think they're in control, right up until they're not." At school, Aaliyah's world continued to shrink. The official notice came Tuesday. She was being removed from advanced classes. The guidance counselor, Ms. Patricia Monroe, called her down to deliver the news. Ms. Monroe sat across from Aaliyah in her small office, surrounded by college pennants and motivational posters. "This isn't a punishment," Ms. Monroe said gently. "Sometimes students need support to rebuild confidence." Aaliyah stared at a poster showing a kitten clinging to a branch. "I didn't do anything wrong. I know transitions are hard, but Ms. Hart has concerns about your recent performance. She called me a liar in front of everyone. My dad is a federal judge. I told the truth, and she punished me for it." Ms. Monroe shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sure there's been miscommunication. Ms. Hart would never intentionally." "She did." Aaliyah stood, hands clenched. "And now everyone thinks I'm either a liar or stupid." She walked out before Ms. Monroe could respond. The news spread quickly. By lunchtime, everyone knew Aaliyah had been dropped from advanced classes. The whispers in the hallway became louder, less careful. Connor Hayes made sure to mention it loudly near her locker. "Guess that federal judge thing didn't work out for her," he said to Jake and Ryan, all three of them laughing. Emma Wallace stood nearby, organizing her books. She glanced at Aaliyah, her expression conflicted. For a moment, it seemed like she might say something. Then Connor called her name, and she turned away. That afternoon, Aaliyah walked home through downtown again, past the courthouse. This time she didn't stop. She couldn't look at it without feeling something break inside her chest. At home, she went straight to her room. When her mother knocked on the door an hour later, Aaliyah was lying on her bed, staring at the ceiling. "Sweetheart, dinner's ready." "I'm not hungry." Diane opened the door anyway and sat on the edge of the bed. She didn't say anything at first, just placed a hand on Aaliyah's ankle. The small gesture of connection. "They took me out of advanced classes," Aaliyah said finally. "Ms. Monroe said it was for my own good, to help me rebuild my confidence." She laughed, but it came out hollow. "How am I supposed to have confidence when every adult at that school thinks I'm either lying or failing?" "Not every adult." Diane squeezed her ankle gently. "Your father requested your school records. Do you know what that means?" Aaliyah shook her head. "It means he's building a case. Not just to defend you, but to expose what's really happening. It takes time, but he's going to make sure the truth comes out." "What if it doesn't matter?" Aaliyah's voice cracked. "What if everyone already decided who I am, and nothing can change that?" Diane was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You know what your father does every day? He listens to people who've been hurt by systems that were supposed to protect them, and then he makes those systems answer for it. He knows how to wait for the right moment. Trust him." Aaliyah wanted to believe that, but trust felt like a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. The week crawled forward. On Wednesday, Aaliyah's new schedule took effect. She sat in regular track classes where the work was simpler, the pace slower, the expectations lower. The teacher, Mr. Greg Phillips, was kind but clearly didn't know what to do with her. When she finished assignments in half the time it took other students, he just gave her extra credit work to keep her busy. During that week, Ms. Hart went about teaching with renewed confidence. The administration had backed her. The superintendent's office acknowledged her concerns. In the teacher's lounge Thursday afternoon, she sat with two colleagues during lunch. "I heard about the Carter situation," Mrs. Rebecca Foster said carefully. "Sounds complicated." Ms. Hart waved dismissively. "It's really not. The father got defensive when I expressed concerns about his daughter's honesty. Now he's trying to intimidate me." Mr. Brian Mitchell frowned. "I thought he was actually a judge." "He claims to be." Ms. Hart's tone suggested skepticism. "But even if he is, it doesn't change that Aaliyah has been struggling and displaying concerning patterns. My job is to educate students, not worry about parents' egos." Mrs. Foster looked uncomfortable. "Federal judge is pretty specific." Ms. Hart's smile tightened. "I've been teaching 12 years. I've seen every kind of parent. The ones who think their child is gifted when they're barely passing, the ones who blame teachers, the ones who threaten legal action." She sipped her water. "This is just another version of that." What Ms. Hart didn't see was the substitute teacher, Mrs. Linda Hayes, sitting in the corner quietly grading papers. Linda was only at Lincoln a few days each month, covering for teachers on sick leave or personal days. She didn't know the politics or the alliances, but she noticed Aaliyah Carter in the hallway 2 weeks ago, a quiet, sad-looking girl who said, "Excuse me," so softly you could barely hear it. Linda had also noticed how other teachers talked about certain students, the assumptions they made, the patterns they enforced without question. She made a mental note of the conversation and continued grading. Friday morning arrived cold and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. Aaliyah woke early, her stomach churning with nervous energy. She couldn't eat breakfast. Her mother made her drink orange juice and eat a piece of toast, but it sat heavy in her stomach like concrete, making her feel slightly nauseated. Malcolm wore a suit, not his courtroom robes, just a dark navy suit with a crisp white shirt and burgundy tie. He looked calm. He always looked calm. But Aaliyah had learned to read the small signs. The way his jaw set just slightly tighter than usual. The way he checked his watch twice instead of once. The way he touched her shoulder before they left the house and said, "Just tell the truth. That's all you have to do." The disciplinary review hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock sharp in the main conference room. When Malcolm and Aaliyah arrived precisely on time, Principal Warren was already there, sitting at the head of a long rectangular table. Ms. Monroe sat to his right, a folder open in front of her, and Ms. Hart sat directly across from them, her posture perfect, her expression professionally concerned. The room was sterile, white walls, fluorescent lighting, a large clock that ticked too loudly. There was a pitcher of water and several glasses on the table, untouched. "Mr. Carter, thank you for coming," Principal Warren said, standing to shake Malcolm's hand. His palm was slightly damp. "And Aaliyah, please, both of you have a seat." They sat on one side of the table. The 3 school officials sat on the other. The positioning was deliberate. 3 against 2, authority against supplicant. Principal Warren cleared his throat. "We've called this meeting to discuss some concerns regarding Aaliyah's recent academic performance and behavioral patterns. Ms. Hart has been her primary instructor this year, and she's observed some troubling trends that we believe warrant intervention and support." Malcolm said nothing. He simply pulled out a leather portfolio and set it on the table in front of him. He didn't open it, just placed it there, visible. Ms. Hart launched into her presentation smoothly. She'd prepared well. She had printed emails, copies of graded work with red marks, charts showing Aaliyah's declining participation. She spoke in that calm, professional voice that sounded so reasonable. "As you can see from this data, Aaliyah's performance has dropped significantly over the past 6 weeks. Her participation in class discussions has decreased. Her assignment quality has declined. And more concerning, she's displayed what I can only describe as a persistent pattern of dishonesty regarding her family background." She slid a paper across the table, Aaliyah's Career Legacy Day essay. When asked to write about her father's profession, Aaliyah claimed he was a federal judge. When I addressed this, gently, I should note, she became defensive. Since then, I've noticed increasing isolation from peers, resistance to feedback, and what appears to be a disconnect from reality. Ms. Monroe nodded, consulting her notes. I've also had concerns. When I met with Aaliyah earlier this week, she was hostile and accusatory. She left my office before our conversation was complete. Malcolm still said nothing. His expression was unreadable. Principal Warren leaned forward. We want to be very clear that our goal here is support, not punishment. We believe Aaliyah would benefit from counseling services and a modified academic track that reduces pressure while she works through these challenges. Then he turned to Aaliyah. Aaliyah, we'd like to hear from you. Can you help us understand what's been happening from your perspective? All eyes turned to her. 12 years old, sitting in a chair that felt too big, facing 3 adults who had already decided what they believed. Her hands were folded in her lap, hidden under the table, pressed together so hard her fingers hurt. Her voice shook when she spoke, but she didn't lie. She never lied. My father is a federal judge, she said. That's the truth. That's what I wrote. That's what I told Miss Hart. And she called me a liar in front of my whole class. Miss Hart sighed loudly, shaking her head with theatrical patience. This is exactly the kind of persistent fabrication we're concerned about. Aaliyah, honey, no one is calling you a liar. We're trying to help you understand the importance of honesty, and the door opened. Everyone turned. Principal Warren's administrative assistant, Mrs. Carol Hughes, stood in the doorway looking flustered. I'm so sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here who says he needs to be part of this meeting. Principal Warren frowned. We're not expecting anyone else. A tall black man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped past Mrs. Hughes into the room. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand and moved with the kind of controlled authority that made people instinctively straighten their posture. His face was calm but commanding, with sharp, intelligent eyes that took in the entire room in a single glance. My apologies for the delay, he said, his voice deep and measured. Traffic from the federal courthouse was heavier than anticipated. Ms. Hart glanced up, her expression shifting from annoyance to confusion. Something about this man felt wrong. Off. Too authoritative to dismiss. Principal Warren stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The color drained from his face in a way that was almost comical. He recognized the man immediately. He'd seen that face in the newspaper just last month, presiding over a major civil rights case that made national headlines. The man walked calmly to the table and set his briefcase down next to Malcolm Carter. Then he extended his hand. Principal Warren, I don't believe we've formally met. I'm Malcolm Carter. He gestured to the man Aaliyah had come with. This is my brother, David Carter. He's been kind enough to accompany my daughter this morning while I finish some business at the courthouse. The room went completely still. Ms. Monroe's pen stopped midward. Miss Hart's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Principal Warren remained standing, frozen, unable to form words. Malcolm, the real Malcolm, Judge Malcolm Carter, pulled out the chair next to his brother and sat down. His movements were unhurried, controlled. He adjusted his cuffs. He met each person's eyes in turn. Then he placed a folder on the table, different from the one David had brought. Thicker, more official. Before we continue, Malcolm said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had commanded courtrooms for years, I need to understand why my daughter is being disciplined for telling the truth about me. The silence that followed was suffocating. Miss Hart's face had gone through several shades: confusion, embarrassment, then a forced attempt at professional recovery. She opened her mouth to speak, but Principal Warren cut her off. Judge Carter. Warren's voice came out slightly strangled. He was still standing, gripping the back of his chair like it might anchor him. I apologize. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. We had no idea that I exist. Malcolm's tone was mild, almost curious. My daughter has been telling you for 6 weeks. The misunderstanding appears to be on your end. Miss Hart finally found her voice. She straightened in her chair, smoothing her blouse, a nervous gesture disguised as composure. Your Honor, I think perhaps there's been some miscommunication. If I had known what exactly, Malcolm didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. That my daughter was telling the truth? Should the truth require verification before it's believed? Ms. Hart's cheeks flushed. Of course not, but you have to understand, from an educational standpoint, when a student makes claims that seem statistically unlikely. Statistically unlikely. Malcolm repeated the words slowly, like he was tasting them. Walk me through that statistical analysis. What data did you use to determine that a black child couldn't have a federal judge for a father? The air in the room became razor-sharp. Ms. Monroe shifted uncomfortably. Principal Warren finally sat down, looking like he might be sick. That's not what I meant, Ms. Hart said quickly. I would never make assumptions based on race. I was simply concerned about a pattern of... We'll come back to patterns. Malcolm opened his folder with deliberate slowness. First, let's address what happened in your classroom on October 15th. Career Legacy Day. He pulled out a document. I've obtained written statements from 3 students who were present. Would you like me to read them, or would you prefer to tell us in your own words how you handle my daughter's assignment? Ms. Hart's hands clenched in her lap under the table. I addressed what I believed to be a dishonest response to an academic assignment by reading her paper aloud to the class. I thought it would be educational to discuss, by encouraging other students to mock her. I never encouraged. You didn't stop them. Malcolm's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. 3 students report that you raised your eyebrow and smiled, while Connor Hayes, Jake Dawson, and Ryan Fletcher laughed at my daughter. You called her answer imaginative and ambitious. Then you told the class that lying is a common coping mechanism among children from unstable backgrounds. Ms. Hart's face had gone pale. Those statements are taken out of context. What context makes humiliating a 12-year-old appropriate? Malcolm looked at Principal Warren. Were you aware this happened? Warren cleared his throat. I was informed there had been a classroom incident, but Ms. Hart's report characterized it differently. She indicated Aaliyah had become defensive when questioned about truthfulness. Defensive? Malcolm turned back to Ms. Hart. My daughter told you the truth. You publicly called her a liar. She maintained her position. And you labeled that as defensiveness? Ms. Monroe finally spoke, her voice hesitant. Judge Carter, I think what we're trying to establish is a pattern of behavior that's been concerning. Yes, let's discuss patterns. Malcolm pulled out more documents. These are my daughter's graded assignments from September through mid-October. Consistent A's and B's. Teacher comments include excellent work, thoughtful analysis, strong participation. He set them aside and pulled out another stack. These are her assignments from late October through November. Would you like to explain the sudden drop? He slid a math quiz across the table. This is from November 2nd. Aaliyah's work. Marked incorrect. He slid another next to it. This is Emma Wallace's quiz from the same day. Identical methodology. Full credit. Ms. Hart picked up the papers, her hands not quite steady. I don't recall the specific. Here's another one. Science homework. Aaliyah's answer marked wrong with no explanation. Tyler Bennett's answer, which uses the same source material and nearly identical phrasing, marked correct with praise. Malcolm's voice never rose. It didn't need to. The documents spoke for themselves. He continued pulling examples. A vocabulary assignment where Aaliyah's definitions were marked as too simplistic, while another student's simpler answers got full credit. A reading comprehension worksheet where Aaliyah's correct answers were labeled unclear with no further explanation. This is just from the records you provided, Malcolm said. Which brings me to another concern. My FERPA request specified all graded work, all communications, all documentation regarding my daughter. What I received was incomplete. Principal Warren's throat bobbed. I assure you, Judge Carter, we provided everything. You provided what you thought was safe to provide. Malcolm pulled out a printed email. This is from Ms. Hart to the school counselor, dated October 16th. The subject line is Student Concern, Aaliyah Carter. In it, Ms. Hart describes my daughter's claim about my profession as a delusional claim and suggests identity confusion and possible instability in the home environment. She recommends counseling evaluation and closer monitoring. He looked at Ms. Monroe. Did you receive this email? Ms. Monroe nodded miserably. Yes. Did you question it? Did you verify the claim before accepting Ms. Hart's characterization of my daughter as delusional? I. We generally trust teacher judgment on these matters, even when that judgment pathologizes a child for telling the truth. Malcolm's gaze was unwavering. This email wasn't in the records you provided me. Neither were several others that reference my daughter's behavioral issues and credibility problems. Why is that? Principal Warren looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Those were internal communications, considered part of staff deliberations. Deliberations about my child's mental health based on fabricated concerns. Those are educational records under FERPA. You were legally required to provide them. Malcolm's tone remained conversational, but the implication was clear. I have them anyway. A colleague who specializes in educational law helped me obtain them through proper channels. The question is why you try to hide them. The room was silent, except for the relentless ticking of the clock. Malcolm turned his attention back to Ms. Hart. Let's talk about the parent conference you requested. You scheduled it for 2 p.m. on a Thursday. Why that time? Ms. Hart blinked. That was the time that worked with my schedule. You assumed I couldn't attend. You scheduled it during standard working hours because you assumed I was either unemployed or working an hourly job that wouldn't allow flexibility. Malcolm's voice was still calm, deadly calm. When I did attend, you asked if I worked security or maintenance near a courthouse. Do you remember that? I was trying to understand. You were trying to reconcile your assumptions with reality. And when I told you I was a federal judge, you smiled politely and changed the subject. You didn't believe me, just like you didn't believe my daughter. You pulled out another document. After that meeting, you sent an email to Principal Warren and copied the superintendent. You described me as aggressive, threatening, and attempting to intimidate you. You mentioned my claims about being a judge, framing it as part of a pattern of deception. You requested administrative support and suggested future meetings include a third party for your protection. Principal Warren closed his eyes briefly, as if in pain. At no point in that meeting did I raise my voice. I didn't threaten you. I asked questions and requested records, which is my legal right as a parent. But you characterized legitimate advocacy as aggression. Malcolm leaned forward slightly. I've seen this before. Many times, actually. Black parents who question authority are labeled hostile. Black children who assert themselves are called defensive. It's a pattern, Ms. Hart, just not the one you claim to see. Ms. Hart's professional mask was cracking. I resent the implication that you humiliated a child for telling the truth. You manipulated her grades. You isolated her socially. You recommended psychological evaluation for invented symptoms. You submitted false reports about both my daughter and me to justify your actions. And when confronted, you try to hide behind institutional protection. Malcolm's voice remained level, but there was no mistaking the judgment in it. What exactly do you resent? Being held accountable. Judge Carter, Principal Warren interjected desperately. I think we can all agree there have been some unfortunate miscommunications. There's been no miscommunication. There's been deliberate harm. Malcolm turned to him. You signed off on removing my daughter from advanced classes based on Ms. Hart's recommendation. Did you review the underlying evidence yourself? I trusted Ms. Hart's professional judgment. You trusted it because it was easier than questioning it. Because challenging a tenured teacher creates problems. Because protecting the institution matters more than protecting a child. Malcolm's eyes were hard. That ends now. He pulled out another document. This is a formal grievance filed with the district under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. It alleges a pattern of racial discrimination in Ms. Hart's classroom and inadequate administrative response. I'm also requesting an external review of disciplinary and academic tracking decisions for all students in Ms. Hart's classes over the past 3 years, broken down by race. Ms. Hart's face went white. You can't seriously. I'm a federal judge, Ms. Hart. I take civil rights violations very seriously. If there's a pattern, and I believe there is, it will be found and addressed. He closed his folder. Effective immediately, all disciplinary actions against my daughter are suspended. She will be returned to advanced classes. Ms. Hart will have no further direct contact with her, and I expect full cooperation with the external review. Principal Warren's voice was hoarse. Of course. Absolutely. We'll do whatever. I'm not finished. Malcolm's gaze swept the room. I want a written apology from Ms. Hart, delivered to my daughter personally, acknowledging that she told the truth and was punished for it. I want a formal correction placed in Aaliyah's academic file, documenting that the grade changes and track removal were unjustified. And I want a clear plan for how this district will prevent this from happening to other children. Silence. Then Malcolm looked at his daughter for the first time since entering the room. Aaliyah sat next to his brother David, her eyes wide, her hands still folded tightly in her lap. She looked small, young, hurt in ways that would take time to heal. But when he met her eyes, he saw something else too. A flicker of relief, of vindication, of understanding that someone had finally listened. "Aaliyah," he said gently, "is there anything you want to add?" She shook her head. Then, after a moment, she found her voice. "I just want people to stop treating me like I'm lying when I'm telling the truth." The simple statement hung in the air like an indictment. Ms. Hart opened her mouth, then closed it. There was nothing she could say that wouldn't make it worse. Principal Warren stood, his movements jerky and uncertain. "Judge Carter, we will absolutely address all of your concerns. I'll personally oversee Aaliyah's return to her proper academic placement and ensure." "This meeting is over," Malcolm said, standing. "My attorney will be in contact regarding the external review. I expect full cooperation and complete documentation. If there are any attempts to retaliate against my daughter or interfere with the investigation, I will pursue every legal remedy available." He picked up his briefcase. David stood as well, placing a hand on Aaliyah's shoulder. The three of them walked to the door. At the threshold, Malcolm paused and looked back. "Ms. Hart, for 12 years, you've had the power to shape how children see themselves. You used that power to hurt my daughter because you made assumptions based on her race. I want you to understand something very clearly." His voice was quiet, but it carried. "That power is gone. The only question now is what else you've done with it, and to whom." They left. The door closed behind them with a soft click. In the conference room, no one moved. No one spoke. The clock kept ticking, marking seconds that felt like hours. Finally, Ms. Hart's hands began to shake. She pressed them flat against the table, trying to stop the trembling. Principal Warren stared at the documents Malcolm had left behind, spread across the table like evidence at a trial. Ms. Monroe looked at Aaliyah's empty chair and felt a wave of shame so profound she couldn't breathe. The room that had felt so controlled, so official, so protected by institutional authority just minutes ago, now felt exactly like what it was, a place where a child had been failed by every adult who was supposed to protect her. And outside, in the hallway, Aaliyah Carter walked between her father and uncle with her head up for the first time in weeks. The truth had finally been heard. Now came the reckoning. The Friday hearing had ended at 10:47 a.m. By noon, Ms. Evelyn Hart was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The decision came from a superintendent's office, delivered personally by Principal Warren in a conversation that lasted less than 5 minutes. Ms. Hart was escorted to her classroom to collect personal items, then asked to leave the building. Her keys, her access card, her classroom, all of it gone in the span of an hour. She sat in her car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at the brick building where she'd taught for 12 years. This couldn't be happening. Not to her. She'd followed protocol. She'd documented everything. She'd acted in the best interest of her students. But as she replayed Judge Carter's calm, devastating questions in her mind, doubt crept in for the first time. Had she been wrong? No. She pushed the thought away. She'd been doing her job. The problem was that Malcolm Carter had power, connections, resources. He was using his position to intimidate the school into backing down. That's what this was really about. A powerful man throwing his weight around because his daughter couldn't handle honest feedback. Ms. Hart started her car and drove home, already composing her defense in her mind. Within 48 hours, the investigation launched. The external review team came from the State Department of Education's Civil Rights Division, brought in at Judge Carter's request. They arrived Monday morning with legal authority to access all school records, interview staff and students, and examine disciplinary patterns across the entire district. Principal Warren greeted them with a nervous smile and complete cooperation. He knew what was at stake now. The investigation team consisted of 3 people. Dr. Marcus Williams, a black man in his 50s who specialized in educational equity. Ms. Jennifer Caldwell, a white woman in her 40s with expertise in institutional discrimination. And Mr. James Richardson, a data analyst who could spot statistical patterns that revealed bias. They set up in an empty classroom and began their work systematically. Dr. Williams started with student interviews. He spoke with Aaliyah first, in a quiet room with soft lighting and comfortable chairs designed to put children at ease. He didn't rush her. He asked open-ended questions and waited patiently for answers, giving her space to find her words. "Tell me about Career Legacy Day," he said gently, his voice warm but professional. Aaliyah described it. The assignment, the laughter, Ms. Hart's tone, the way she'd held up the paper like it was evidence of something shameful, the detention that followed. Her voice stayed steady until she got to the part about other students repeating federal judge like it was a punchline, making it sound ridiculous. Then her throat tightened and she had to pause. "Take your time," Dr. Williams said. "You're doing great." She continued. "Connor said maybe my dad was a janitor and I got confused." Everyone laughed. Ms. Hart didn't stop them. "Did anyone else get detention that day?" Dr. Williams asked. "No, just me." "Did Ms. Hart discipline the students who were laughing at you?" "No." She smiled at them, like she thought it was funny too. Dr. Williams made careful notes, his pen moving steadily across the page. Then he asked about her grades, the group project where her work was dismissed, the removal from advanced classes. Aaliyah answered every question truthfully, her hands folded in her lap the way they'd been during the hearing, a habit she'd developed to keep them from shaking. When the interview ended, Dr. Williams thanked her. "You've been very brave, Aaliyah. I want you to know that." She nodded but didn't feel brave. She just felt tired. Over the next week, Dr. Williams and Ms. Caldwell interviewed 17 other students from Ms. Hart's classes, current and former. The pattern emerged quickly. 3 black students described similar experiences of being publicly questioned about their family backgrounds or achievements. A black boy named Marcus Thompson said Ms. Hart had accused him of plagiarism on an essay that was entirely his own work. A black girl named Jasmine Williams recalled being marked down for attitude problems after respectfully disagreeing with Ms. Hart's interpretation of a reading passage. White students had different stories. Several mentioned that Ms. Hart was strict but fair. Some genuinely liked her. But when pressed about whether they'd seen her treat students differently, a few became uncomfortable. Emma Wallace, Aaliyah's former friend, admitted quietly that she'd noticed Ms. Hart called on black students less often and interrupted them more frequently. "I thought I was imagining it," Emma said, her voice small. "I didn't want to think Ms. Hart was like that." Then came the former students. A young woman named Keisha Barnes, now in high school, had been in Ms. Hart's class 3 years earlier. She described being told her career aspirations to become a doctor were unrealistic and that she should consider more practical options. Ms. Hart had recommended she be moved to a lower academic track. Keisha's parents had fought it, hired a tutor, and proved their daughter was fully capable. She was now in honors classes and thriving. "I still remember how she looked at me when I said I wanted to be a surgeon," Keisha told Dr. Williams. "Like I was delusional, like I was lying about my own dreams." Dr. Williams documented everything. The interviews painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Mr. Richardson analyzed the data. He pulled grade distributions, disciplinary records, and academic tracking decisions for every student Ms. Hart had taught over the past 10 years. He controlled for prior academic performance, standardized test scores, and socioeconomic factors. Then he ran the numbers. The results were damning. Black students in Ms. Hart's classes received lower grades than white students with identical test scores and prior performance. They were disciplined at 3 times the rate for subjective infractions like disrespect or dishonesty. They were referred for behavioral evaluations at 5 times the rate. And they were removed from advanced academic tracks at nearly 4 times the rate, even when their academic records justified placement. The statistical disparity was so significant that it couldn't be explained by chance, teaching style, or legitimate educational judgment. It was bias, measurable and consistent. Mr. Richardson presented his findings to Dr. Williams and Ms. Caldwell in a conference room filled with charts and spreadsheets. "This isn't subtle," he said, pointing to a graph showing the disciplinary gap. "This is systematic." Ms. Caldwell studied the data, her expression grim. And the administration knew. They had to have known. They did. When the team interviewed Principal Warren, he admitted he'd received complaints about Ms. Hart before. Two parents had raised concerns about racial bias in the past 3 years. Both times, Warren had spoken to Ms. Hart privately, accepted her explanations, and taken no formal action. He'd prioritized maintaining staff morale over investigating legitimate concerns. "I trusted her professional judgment," Warren said, repeating the same phrase he'd used in the hearing. "I didn't think it was appropriate to second-guess her in front of parents." Even when the complaints showed a pattern, Ms. Caldwell asked. Warren looked down at his hands. "I thought they were isolated incidents. I thought parents were being oversensitive." "Did you document those complaints?" A long pause. "No." The investigation team requested Ms. Hart's emails, provided by the district's IT department. What they found was revealing, not because of explicit racism. Ms. Hart was too careful for that, but because of patterns. She used different language when describing black students versus white students. Black students who struggled were unmotivated or dishonest. White students who struggled, needed support, or were going through a difficult time. Black students who excelled were described as surprising or met with skepticism. White students who excelled were living up to their potential. One email stood out. Sent to Ms. Monroe 2 years earlier, it described a black student's claim that his mother was a hospital administrator. Ms. Hart had written, "I find this highly unlikely given the family circumstances. More likely the mother works in hospital maintenance or food service. I'm concerned about the child's need to exaggerate." She'd been wrong. The mother was indeed a hospital administrator. Ms. Hart had never apologized or corrected her assumption in the student's file. By the end of the second week, the investigation team had compiled a comprehensive report. It documented a decade-long pattern of racial bias in Ms. Hart's classroom, inadequate administrative oversight, and systemic failures to protect students from discrimination. The report included 23 specific incidents, statistical analysis showing measurable disparities, and testimony from 14 witnesses. The findings were forwarded to the district superintendent, Dr. Robert Mitchell, who read the report in his office with growing horror. This wasn't just about one teacher anymore. This was about institutional liability, about federal civil rights violations, about potential lawsuits that could bankrupt the district. He called an emergency meeting with the school board for Thursday evening. The school board meeting took place in the district's main administrative building, a nondescript 2-story structure on the edge of town with beige siding and small windows. Normally, these meetings drew a handful of attendees, parents with specific concerns about playground equipment or cafeteria menus, teachers seeking policy changes, the occasional local reporter covering routine business. Tonight, the room was packed wall to wall with standing room only. Word had spread through the community like wildfire. Parents who'd had their own concerns about Ms. Hart over the years now felt safe coming forward, emboldened by the investigation's findings. Community members who'd followed Judge Carter's grievance wanted to see accountability in action. Local media had caught wind of the investigation through sources at the district office, and 3 news cameras were set up in the back of the room, their bright lights making everything feel more official and permanent. Malcolm Carter sat in the 3rd row with his wife and daughter, positioned where he could see both the board and the audience. He'd been invited to speak during the public comment period. Aaliyah sat between her parents, watching people file in with wide eyes. She'd never seen this many adults angry on her behalf. The board members filed in and took their seats at the long table at the front of the room, looking uncomfortable and tense. 5 elected officials who looked deeply uncomfortable with the sudden media attention and community scrutiny. Board Chair Thomas Bradley, a white man in his 60s, called the meeting to order at 7 p.m. sharp. The agenda included routine items first, budget approvals, curriculum updates, facility maintenance. The board rushed through them, everyone aware of the real reason people were here. Finally, Bradley cleared his throat and addressed the elephant in the room. We're aware that many of you are here regarding the ongoing investigation into allegations of discrimination at Lincoln Middle School. Superintendent Mitchell will provide an update. Dr. Mitchell stood, his hands gripping a folder containing the investigation report. He looked like a man who hadn't slept well in days. He probably hadn't. Thank you, Mr. Chair. As many of you know, we initiated an external investigation following a formal complaint filed by Judge Malcolm Carter regarding treatment of his daughter by a Lincoln Middle School teacher. That investigation has been completed. He paused, steadying himself. The findings are deeply troubling. He summarized the report, the interviews, the statistical analysis, the pattern of differential treatment based on race. He didn't name Ms. Hart directly, citing personnel privacy, but everyone in the room knew who he was talking about. The investigation confirmed that a teacher at Lincoln Middle School engaged in systematic discriminatory behavior over a period of approximately 10 years. This behavior included disparate grading, disciplinary practices, and academic tracking decisions that disproportionately harmed Black students. Additionally, the investigation found that administrative oversight was inadequate to identify and address this pattern. The room erupted in angry murmurs. Parents turned to each other, confirming suspicions they'd harbored for years. Bradley gavelled for order. Dr. Mitchell continued. Effective immediately, the teacher in question has been terminated for cause. Her teaching credential will be reported to the state licensing board. We are also implementing new oversight procedures, mandatory bias training for all staff, and an independent review of academic tracking decisions made over the past 3 years. More murmurs, some approving, some skeptical. We recognize that these measures, while necessary, cannot undo the harm that has been done to students who were subjected to discriminatory treatment. We are committed to making this right. Mitchell's voice wavered slightly. We failed these children. We failed to protect them. And I personally apologize to every family that was affected. He sat down. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Bradley opened the public comment period. We'll hear from anyone who wishes to address the board. Please state your name for the record and limit comments to 3 minutes. The first to speak was Keisha Barnes' mother, Mrs. Angela Barnes. She walked to the microphone with her daughter beside her, both of them dignified and furious. My daughter was told she wasn't smart enough to be a doctor, Mrs. Barnes said, her voice steady but hard. She was pushed out of advanced classes despite having straight A's. When I complained, I was told I was being oversensitive, that I was playing the race card, that I didn't understand educational standards. She paused, looking directly at Principal Warren, who sat behind the superintendent. You knew. Parents told you. And you did nothing because it was easier to protect a teacher than to protect our children. Applause erupted. Bradley didn't gavel it down. Next came Marcus Thompson's father, Mr. Derek Thompson. My son was accused of cheating on work he did himself. He was suspended for dishonesty, even though there was no evidence. When I demanded proof, I was told the teacher's judgment was sufficient. That's not education. That's prejudice hiding behind authority. More applause. One by one, parents testified. Some had pulled their children from Lincoln years ago. Others had stayed and fought quiet battles. All of them had been dismissed, gaslit, told they were imagining things or being difficult. Then Malcolm Carter approached the microphone. The room fell silent. He didn't need 3 minutes. He didn't need a shout. He simply stated facts. My daughter told the truth. She was punished for it. Not because she was disruptive or dishonest, but because a teacher made assumptions based on her race. When I sought answers, I was characterized as hostile. When I requested records, I was stonewalled. This investigation only happened because I had resources most parents don't have: legal expertise, institutional knowledge, professional credibility. He paused. But every child deserves protection regardless of whether their parent is a judge. The question now is whether this district will actually change, or whether you will just wait for the next powerful parent to force accountability. He stepped away from the microphone. The applause was deafening. The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Bradley attempted to respond. Judge Carter, I want to assure you that we take these findings seriously and we're committed to. With respect, Mr. Bradley, I've heard commitments before. From administrators, from teachers, from institutions that promise change and deliver excuses. Malcolm's voice cut through the room. What I want is action, real oversight, real consequences, real protection for children who can't fight back. Bradley nodded weakly. We understand, and we will, but Malcolm wasn't finished. I'm also announcing that I'm working with the families here tonight to explore legal action, not just against the teacher, but against the district for enabling this pattern. You had multiple complaints. You had data. You chose to ignore it. That's not just negligence. That's institutional complicity. The room went electric. Board members looked at their legal counsel, who looked distinctly pale. The meeting continued for another hour. More parents spoke. Board members made promises. The local news cameras captured everything. By the time Bradley gavelled the meeting to a close at 9:30, it was clear that Lincoln Middle School would never be the same. Outside in the parking lot, families gathered in small groups, trading phone numbers and stories. Aaliyah stood next to her mother, watching. Are you okay? Diane asked quietly. Aaliyah thought about it. Was she okay? Ms. Hart was gone. The investigation had proven she'd been telling the truth. Other families believed her now, but she still felt the weight of those weeks, the isolation, the self-doubt, the loneliness of being called a liar every day. I don't know, she said honestly, but I'm better than I was. Diane pulled her close. That's a start. Across the parking lot, Malcolm stood talking with other parents, coordinating next steps. Mrs. Barnes approached him, her daughter Keisha at her side. Thank you, Mrs. Barnes said, for not just fighting for your daughter, for fighting for all of them. Malcolm shook his head. I should have done it sooner. I should have known this wasn't just about Aaliyah. You did what you could when you could. That matters. They stood there for a moment, two parents who understood the particular exhaustion of fighting systems that weren't designed to protect their children. Then Mrs. Barnes extended her hand. We're going to make sure this means something, she said. Real change, not just apologies. Malcolm shook her hand firmly. Agreed. As families began dispersing into the night, a local reporter approached Malcolm with a camera crew. Judge Carter, can we get a statement? Malcolm glanced at Aaliyah, who was watching from beside the car. She gave a small nod. My daughter is 12 years old, Malcolm said to the camera. She told the truth and was punished for it. That should terrify every parent. The fact that it took a federal judge to get anyone to listen should embarrass every educator. We're going to make sure this district understands that every child, regardless of their parent's profession or their family's resources, deserves to be believed, protected, and treated with dignity. The reporter asked follow-up questions, but Malcolm politely declined. He had said what needed to be said. The family drove home in silence, processing everything that had happened. When they pulled into their driveway, Aaliyah spoke for the first time since leaving the meeting. Dad, yes, sweetheart. Thank you for believing me. Malcolm turned in his seat to look at his daughter. Always. Every single time. No matter what. Inside the house, Aaliyah went to her room. She pulled out the Career Legacy Day assignment from her folder, the one Ms. Hart had read aloud with mockery. She looked at her own handwriting. My father is a federal judge. She'd been so proud when she wrote it, then so ashamed when everyone laughed. Now, she felt something different. Not pride exactly, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing she'd never lied. She filed the paper away carefully. Maybe someday she'd throw it out. But for now, it was proof of the truth, of what she'd survived, of why it mattered. Downstairs, Malcolm sat at his desk reviewing documents for the potential lawsuit. Diane brought him coffee and sat beside him. Do you think anything will actually change? She asked. Malcolm was quiet for a moment. Some things will. Training will happen. Policies will be written. People will be more careful. He paused. But real change? That's harder. It requires institutions to admit they've been complicit in harm, to dismantle systems that protect adults instead of children. That doesn't happen quickly. Then why do it? Because Aaliyah deserves it. And because there are other Aaliyahs in classrooms right now being told their truth doesn't matter. If we can make it a little harder for teachers like Ms. Hart to harm them, that's worth fighting for. Diane leaned her head on his shoulder. They sat there together, two parents who'd just declared war on a system that had failed their child, knowing the fight was far from over, but refusing to back down. Across town, Ms. Evelyn Hart sat in her darkened living room, scrolling through news coverage of the school board meeting on her phone. Her termination was official now. Public. Her name was being discussed on social media, in parent groups, in education forums. People she taught with for years weren't returning her calls. She wanted to feel wronged. She wanted to feel like the victim of political correctness and overreach. But watching Judge Carter's statement on the news, seeing the faces of parents she'd dismissed over the years, reading the statistics from the investigation report that showed undeniable patterns, doubt crept in again. Had she really treated students differently? Had her assumptions shaped her decisions in ways she'd never consciously acknowledged? The thought was unbearable. So she pushed it away, poured another glass of wine, and began researching lawyers who specialized in wrongful termination. The battle was far from over. Ms. Evelyn Hart's termination became official on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after the school board meeting. The letter arrived by certified mail, citing violations of professional conduct, documented discriminatory behavior, and breach of equity policies. Her teaching credential would be reported to the state licensing board with a recommendation for revocation. She read the letter 3 times, hands trembling. Then she called the attorney she'd hired, Richard Stoltz, who specialized in employment law. "To try and make an example of me," she said. "This is about optics, not facts." Stoltz listened, taking notes. "We can fight this, but I need to ask, is there any truth to the discrimination allegations?" Ms. Hart hesitated. "I treated all students according to the same standards. If some performed poorly, that's not my fault." It wasn't quite an answer, and Stoltz knew it. "We'll prepare a response. But given the evidence, this will be an uphill battle. I've been teaching for 12 years without incident. That has to count for something. We'll use it." Stoltz paused. "But you should prepare for the possibility we might not win. And even if we do, your reputation here is damaged." The words hit harder than the termination letter. Relocating meant admitting defeat. She'd built a career at Lincoln, and now it was gone because one powerful parent had decided to make her the villain. That's how she framed it. Not as accountability, but as persecution. Meanwhile, the district moved forward with promised changes. Mandatory bias training was scheduled. A new oversight committee formed with parent representatives. Academic tracking would require multiple educator review. Disciplinary data would be tracked by race and reviewed quarterly. Principal Warren implemented changes with nervous efficiency. He knew his job was on the line. He'd failed to address complaints, failed to identify patterns, failed to protect students. In the teacher's lounge, the atmosphere had shifted. Some teachers embraced the new policies, relieved to have clearer guidelines and accountability. Others resented the implication that they needed oversight, viewing the changes as administrative overreach born from one parent's crusade. Mrs. Rebecca Foster and Mr. Brian Mitchell, the colleagues who'd heard Ms. Hart's dismissive comments about the Carter situation, found themselves in an uncomfortable position. They'd said nothing when it mattered. They'd laughed politely, changed the subject, avoided confrontation. Now, they had to live with the knowledge that their silence had enabled harm. "We should have said something," Mrs. Foster admitted to Mr. Mitchell one afternoon, her voice low. "I know." He stared at his coffee. "I told myself it wasn't my business, that I didn't know the full story, that maybe she had a point." He shook his head. "I was wrong. What do we do now? We do better. We pay attention, and we don't stay quiet when we see something wrong." He met her eyes, even when it's uncomfortable. The substitute teacher, Mrs. Linda Hayes, was offered a permanent position. She accepted, understanding that her willingness to notice and document patterns had mattered. On her first day as a full-time teacher, she made a promise to herself. She would never assume a child was lying just because their truth seemed unlikely. For Aaliyah, returning to advanced classes felt both validating and strange. Her new teacher, Ms. Patricia Sullivan, was warm and encouraging, clearly aware of Aaliyah's situation and determined to make her feel welcome. But the other students were different now. Some avoided her, uncomfortable with the controversy surrounding her name. Others were overly friendly, performing kindness in a way that felt false. Emma Wallace approached her during lunch 2 weeks into the new semester. "Can I sit with you?" Emma asked quietly. Aaliyah looked up from her book. Part of her wanted to say no, to punish Emma for abandoning her when things got hard. But she also remembered that Emma had told the truth to the investigators. She'd admitted what she'd seen. "Okay," Aaliyah said. Emma sat down, unwrapping her sandwich slowly. "I'm sorry for not standing up for you, for joining Connor's group instead of staying your friend. I was scared of being treated the way you were. And that's not an excuse, but it's the truth." Aaliyah didn't respond immediately. She was learning that forgiveness wasn't automatic, that people didn't earn it just by apologizing. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I talked to the investigators. And afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about how I watched Ms. Hart treat you differently and convinced myself I was imagining it. I chose comfort over doing the right thing." Emma's voice wavered. "I don't know if we can be friends again, but I wanted you to know I'm sorry." Aaliyah considered this. "It hurt when you left, when everyone left. I know, and saying sorry doesn't erase that. I know, but maybe we can start over. Not where we were, but somewhere new." Aaliyah met Emma's eyes. "If you actually mean it." Emma nodded, tears spilling over. "I mean it." They ate lunch together that day. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't easy, but it was honest, and that mattered. At home, Aaliyah started therapy with Dr. Michelle Grant, a Black woman who specialized in helping children process trauma and discrimination. Dr. Grant's office was filled with plants, soft lighting, and comfortable chairs that didn't feel clinical. "How are you feeling about everything that's happened?" Dr. Grant asked during their third session. Aaliyah thought carefully. "Angry. Even though Ms. Hart is gone, and everyone knows I was telling the truth. I'm still angry. That's completely normal. Anger is appropriate when you've been harmed. But everyone keeps acting like it's over now. Like I should just be happy things changed. And I'm glad she's gone, but..." Aaliyah's voice caught. "It doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't make me forget how it felt when everyone laughed at me. No, it doesn't. Justice doesn't heal wounds automatically. It just stops new ones from being created." Dr. Grant leaned forward slightly. "You're allowed to be angry. You're allowed to still hurt. Those feelings don't mean the fight wasn't worth it. Then what do I do with them? We figure that out together. We learn how to carry them without letting them carry you." The sessions became a safe space where Aaliyah could be honest about the complex emotions swirling inside her. Relief and anger, vindication and grief, hope and exhaustion all tangled together. Meanwhile, the legal action Malcolm had mentioned was taking shape. He'd partnered with a civil rights attorney named Monica Shaw, a Black woman with 20 years of experience litigating education discrimination cases. Together with affected families, they filed a class action lawsuit against the district alleging systemic failure to address racial bias, deliberate indifference to student complaints, and inadequate oversight of discriminatory teachers. The district's legal team pushed for settlement. They knew the evidence was damning, knew that a trial would expose years of negligence. Superintendent Mitchell wanted this resolved quietly, without more media attention, without more damage to the district's reputation. The settlement negotiations took 3 months. In the end, the district agreed to a comprehensive package: monetary damages to affected families, funding for a new equity and inclusion office with independent oversight authority, mandatory annual civil rights audits, and scholarships for students who'd been improperly removed from advanced tracks. But Malcolm insisted on one more thing: a public acknowledgement. Not a vague apology about mistakes or misunderstandings, but a clear statement admitting that Black students have been systematically discriminated against and that the district had failed to protect them. The district's lawyers resisted. Admissions like that created liability, opened doors to future lawsuits, made people uncomfortable. "Good," Malcolm said flatly. "People should be uncomfortable. My daughter was uncomfortable every day she walked into that classroom. These families deserve an acknowledgement that what happened to them was real, was wrong, and was the district's responsibility to prevent." The district agreed. The public statement was read at a school board meeting, printed in local newspapers, and posted on the district's website. It didn't fix everything, but it validated what every affected family had known. They'd been failed, and it mattered. Ms. Hart's wrongful termination lawsuit proceeded separately. Her attorney argued procedural violations and claimed the investigation was biased. But when the case went before an administrative law judge, the evidence was overwhelming. The statistical analysis alone was damning. The witness testimony was consistent and credible. The documented complaints Principal Warren had ignored established that the district had had multiple opportunities to intervene. The judge ruled against Ms. Hart on every count. The termination was upheld. Her teaching credential was formally revoked. She could appeal, her attorney told her, but the chances of success were minimal and the process would be expensive and public. Ms. Hart sat in her lawyer's office, staring at the ruling. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly consider the possibility that she'd been wrong. Not about individual incidents. She could still rationalize those, still convince herself that her judgments had been reasonable. But about the pattern, about the Leegee effect of 1,000 small assumptions, 1,000 tiny moments where she'd looked at a black child and expected less, believed less, offered less. Had she really done that? The thought was unbearable. So she pushed it away one more time, signed the paperwork to end her appeal, and began searching for jobs in other states where her name wouldn't be recognized. 6 months after the hearing that changed everything, Lincoln Middle School held a special assembly. It was part of the district's new equity initiative, a series of student-led conversations about identity, fairness, and speaking truth to power. Aaliyah had been asked to speak. The invitation came from Principal Warren himself, delivered with obvious nervousness and what seemed like genuine remorse. He understood she had every reason to say no. She'd thought about it for 2 weeks. Talked to her parents, talked to Dr. Grant, talked to the part of herself that still felt raw and angry. "You don't have to do this," her mother said. "You don't owe them anything." "I know." Aaliyah stared at the invitation letter. "But maybe I want to. Not for them. For me." On the morning of the assembly, Aaliyah stood backstage in the auditorium, her hands shaking. The entire school was out there, students who'd laughed at her, students who'd ignored her, students who'd never known her story, and students who'd lived versions of it themselves. Dr. Grant's words echoed in her mind. "You get to choose how to tell your story, and you get to choose when to stop telling it." Principal Warren introduced her with careful words about courage and resilience. Then Aaliyah walked to the podium, her footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet auditorium. She looked out at hundreds of faces, some curious, some sympathetic, some defensive. She saw Emma sitting in the 3rd row, offering an encouraging nod. She saw Connor Hayes in the back, slouched in his seat, expression unreadable. And in the very back, near the exit, she saw her father. He'd taken the morning off, told the court he had a family obligation. He wasn't standing. He wasn't drawing attention. He was just there. Aaliyah took a breath and began. "My name is Aaliyah Carter. 7 months ago, I wrote an essay for Career Legacy Day about what my father does for a living. I wrote that he's a federal judge. I was telling the truth. But my teacher didn't believe me." Her voice wavered slightly, then found its strength and steadied. She read my paper out loud to the class and called it imaginative. Other students laughed. Someone suggested my dad was probably a janitor, and I got confused. The teacher smiled. She gave me detention for dishonesty. And then she started treating me differently every single day after that. Aaliyah described what followed: the grade manipulation, the isolation, the removal from advanced classes. She didn't embellish. She didn't exaggerate. She just told the truth plainly, letting the facts speak for themselves. But this isn't just my story. It's happened to other students in this school. Students who were told their dreams were unrealistic. Students who were punished more harshly for the same behavior. Students who were assumed to be lying or cheating or less capable because of how they looked. She paused, letting that sink in. I want to talk about what it felt like to be called a liar for telling the truth. It felt like the ground disappearing under my feet. Like nothing I said mattered because someone with more power had decided who I was allowed to be. The auditorium was completely silent now. And the worst part? I started to doubt myself. I started wondering if maybe I was wrong, even though I knew I wasn't. That's what happens when enough people tell you your truth isn't real. Aaliyah's hands gripped the podium. My father is a federal judge. He had resources and knowledge that most parents don't have. He could hire lawyers, file complaints, demand investigations. And that's the only reason people listened. That's wrong. Every kid deserves to be believed. Every kid deserves to be protected, not just the ones whose parents have power. She looked directly at Principal Warren, who was sitting to the side of the stage. The changes that happened here, the new policies, the training, the oversight, those are good. But they only happened because my family could force them to happen. How many students suffered before me? How many will suffer in other schools where no one has the power to make adults listen? The question hung in the air. I'm not sharing this story to make you feel sorry for me. I'm sharing it because silence protects people who do harm. And because some of you might be going through something similar right now. And I want you to know it's not in your head. Your truth matters, even when people don't believe it. She took a breath, preparing for the end. Truth doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs space to exist. She paused, but it also needs witnesses. People who will listen, who will believe, who will stand up even when it's uncomfortable. I hope you'll be those people. For each other. For yourselves. Aaliyah stepped back from the podium. The applause started slowly, then built. But she wasn't focused on that. She was focused on the feeling of having said what she needed to say on her terms, in her own words. As students filed out of the auditorium, several approached her. A black girl in 7th grade whispered, "Thank you." A white boy apologized for laughing that day in class. A teacher she'd never met shook her hand and said, "You're incredibly brave." Aaliyah accepted their words, but didn't let them define her. Brave felt too simple for what she'd lived through. She'd just been a kid trying to survive something that shouldn't have happened. Later that afternoon, Aaliyah sat with her parents in the living room. Her father had brought home her favorite takeout, and they ate together while Aaliyah decompressed from the emotional weight of the assembly. "You did beautifully," Diane said, squeezing her daughter's hand. "It was hard," Aaliyah admitted, "but also kind of freeing. Like I got to control the narrative for once instead of everyone else telling my story." Malcolm had been quiet, but now he spoke. "I'm proud of you. Not for what you said, though it was powerful, but for choosing to say it at all. You could have walked away from all of this. No one would have blamed you." "I thought about it," Aaliyah said. "But Dr. Grant helped me realize that telling my story isn't the same as reliving my trauma. I get to decide what it means." "And what does it mean?" Malcolm asked gently. Aaliyah thought carefully. "It means I survived something hard. It means systems can be changed, but it takes work. And it means I don't have to carry what happened to me silently just to make other people comfortable." Malcolm nodded, respect clear in his eyes. That's wisdom most adults never learn. Over the following weeks, something interesting happened. Aaliyah found herself caring less about what had happened and more about what came next. She threw herself into her schoolwork, rediscovering the joy of learning without fear of arbitrary punishment. She joined a debate team, where her ability to construct logical arguments and speak clearly made her stand out. She started writing, not just for assignments, but for herself. One afternoon, she began drafting her college essay, even though college was years away. She didn't write about injustice or her father or the investigation. She wrote about resilience, about finding her voice, about learning that truth doesn't require permission. Emma had become a real friend again, the kind built on honesty rather than convenience. They studied together, ate lunch together, and talked about things that mattered. Emma never asked to be thanked for her apology or her testimony. She just showed up consistently, proving through actions that her words had been real. Aaliyah also made new friends, students who knew her story but related to her as a person, not a symbol. She was still quiet, still thoughtful, but she no longer folded her hands under desks to hide their shaking. She raised her hand in class. She spoke up when she disagreed. She took up space. A year after the hearing, Aaliyah was asked to participate in a district-wide student equity council being formed as part of the settlement. The council would advise administrators on policies affecting students, with real input and decision-making power. Aaliyah accepted, not because she wanted to relive what had happened, but because she could help make sure it didn't happen to others. At the first meeting, she sat with students from across the district, Kids of all backgrounds who'd experienced their own versions of being dismissed, underestimated, or harmed by systems that should have protected them. Together, they began building something better. One afternoon, years later, Aaliyah walked through downtown on her way home from school. She passed the courthouse, the building she used to avoid looking at because it reminded her of being called a liar, of feeling small and powerless. This time, she stopped and looked up, not at the building itself, but at what it represented. Justice. Accountability. The slow, imperfect work of making things right even when it's difficult. She'd been thinking lately about what she wanted to study in college. Medicine, like her mother? Business? Education, to change the system from inside and help other students? Or maybe law? Not because of her father, though his example mattered deeply and had shaped how she saw justice, but because she'd learned something powerful. Institutions could be forced to do better when someone knew how to make them answer. She'd seen it happen. She'd been part of making it happen. The idea felt right in a way she couldn't quite articulate yet. She wasn't deciding yet. She was just considering carefully, trying the possibility on like a coat to see if it fit. Aaliyah smiled slightly, pulled out her phone, and texted her father. "Can I come visit your courtroom sometime? I want to see what you actually do." The response came quickly. "Always. I'll arrange it. Proud of you, sweetheart." She put her phone away and kept walking, heading home through a city that felt a little different than it had a year ago. Not because the city had changed, but because she had. Ms. Hart faded from relevance, eventually taking a job in a different state, working in educational consulting, far from classrooms and accountability. She told herself she'd been treated unfairly, a victim of overcorrection and political pressure. Sometimes, late at night, doubt crept in, but she'd become practiced at pushing it away. Aaliyah didn't think about Ms. Hart much anymore. Her former teacher had taken up too much space in her life already. She had better things to focus on: her future, her dreams, her voice. The last time Aaliyah spoke publicly about what happened was at her 8th grade graduation. She'd been chosen to give a student speech, and she kept it brief. "We learned a lot of things in middle school," she said to her graduating class. "Math, science, history. But the most important thing I learned was this: your truth doesn't need permission to exist. Speak it anyway, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." She graduated with honors, surrounded by family and friends who'd seen her at her lowest and watched her rise. And when she walked across that stage to receive her diploma, Aaliyah Carter carried herself with quiet dignity. Not because she defeated an enemy or won a battle, but because she'd learned to value her own truth above anyone else's doubt. That was the real victory. That was what mattered. If your truth required someone else's power to be believed, would you still have the courage to speak it? Hit that like button if this story moved you, and subscribe for more powerful stories about standing up when the system stands down.